chances were pretty good that Jim Key would deliver a less than adequate, less than sincere, sweep it under the carpet kind of apology. Essentially an apology that admitted some past mistakes, but essentially, wouldn't really be of much value. Sure enough, during the UUA-GA of 2014, UUA moderator Jim Key inserted his apology, or so-called apology, to UU clergy sexual misconduct victims into the middle of his moderator's report to the UUA-GA, which right off the bat is basically not an acceptable way of delivering an apology, especially since he led up to the apology with all kinds of self-deprecating humor. So like people were literally laughing right up to the point where Jim delivered the apology. There was no sort of dignified, sober leading into the apology. On the contrary, people, as I said, were laughing and giggling and so on at Jim's self-deprecating humor and so on in the lead-up. And as expected, Jim delivered a basically worthless apology to clergy sexual misconduct victims. It actually wasn't even as good as the first apology, but it was even worse than I expected. I expected a sort of mealy-mouthed, not really very comprehensive or sincere apology, but I did not expect Jim Key or anyone else delivering the apology to outright lie in the apology. But that's exactly what happened. Jim Key told at least two outright lies, and one of them is utterly shameful. In his so-called apology, Jim Key said, I'm trying to get the words exact here, "There were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations." So, what's Jim Key saying? He's saying that he personally investigated Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, and in his personal investigations of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, he found no evidence of any clergy sexual abuse of children. Well, this is an outright lie, as I said. Reverend Mac Mitchell, amongst others, has been convicted of sexual abuse of children, unless you want to deem that teenage Tibetan refugees don't count as children. But Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell was charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape of teenage Tibetan refugees. And as I said, other Unitarian Universalist ministers have been charged, tried, and convicted of other sexual abuse of children, perhaps less serious sexual abuse of children, molestation as opposed to outright forcible rape and so on, but perhaps not as well. The UUA does such a good job of hiding the truth, that it is difficult to determine exactly, what these ministers did. It's clear that ministers were charged, tried, and convicted of sexual abuse of children, but it's not clear what exactly those crimes were, except in the well-publicized case of Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell. So Jim Key literally stood up in front of thousands of Unitarian Universalist delegates at the Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly in Providence, Rhode Island in June of 2014 and outright lied to them about clergy sex abuse of children in what was supposed to be UUA apology to to victims of UU clergy sexual misconduct. Jim Key essentially denied the existence of any clergy sexual abuse of children. He didn't exactly outright deny it, but his words, would lead people to believe that no children have ever been abused by Unitarian Universalist ministers. That's what his claim leads people to believe. As well as that, in the broader sense, Jim Key claimed that only a small number of Unitarian Universalist ministers are guilty of clergy sexual misconduct. Well, that's not true either. In fact, a group of Unitarian Universalist interim ministers, specifically what are called, if I remember correctly, I think after pastors is what they call themselves. Basically, not just your ordinary run-of-the-mill interim minister, but interim ministers who come in after a minister has resigned as a result of having been, found to have committed some kind of sexual misconduct. They were concerned about the situation, and they decided that they would start counting, how many Unitarian Universalist Association congregations had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. Well, they stopped counting when they reached 400. So these ministers, they identified, 400 different Unitarian Universalist congregations that had a minister who had been found to have committed clergy sexual misconduct at some point between 1961 and whenever they did this count, which was, I assume, some years ago. The UUA has a little over 1,000 congregations. The UUA currently has, I think, around 1,040. It's never, I think, been higher than 1,060. So 400 congregations minimum is almost 40% of all Unitarian Universalist Association congregations that have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. Is that a small number of ministers? It's not even a small number of congregations. It's 400 congregations, and some of those congregations would have had multiple cases of clergy sexual misconduct with different ministers. Some of those congregations have had 2 or more cases of clergy sexual misconduct, in the time span between 1961 and now. 1961 was the date of the merger between the Unitarian Universalist Association and the Universalist Church of America. So that is the beginning of the history of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And we're not talking about clergy sexual misconduct that took place before that. We're talking about clergy sexual misconduct between 1961 and 2000 and something, I assume, when they made this calculation. And since they made that calculation, there's been other cases of clergy sexual misconduct. Of course, some of these cases may have taken place at congregations that had previously had a clergy sexual misconduct problem, so they may not have added to the number of congregations, but they certainly added to the number of ministers. So yeah, 400 minimum congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association affected by one form of clergy sexual misconduct or another. And by other estimates, by people who are very well informed about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct issues, 2/3 or more of Unitarian Universalist associations, congregations, have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct. Have had a minister who has committed clergy sexual misconduct at some point in his or her career. because it's not just male Unitarian Universalist ministers that are guilty of clergy sexual misconduct. There are female ministers as well. So I see we're coming up to near the end of our first half-hour segment of protesting and video. So we'll wrap this up soon. Jim Key outright lied about clergy sexual abuse in general and clergy sexual abuse of children in particular in what is effectively basically a worthless apology. You cannot have outright lies in an apology and expect that apology to be, even partially valid. There may be some things that he said that may have some partial validity, but when Jim Key outright lies about certain things, well, then it calls into question the credibility and integrity of all the other statements in the apology. And like I said, it was a pretty lame apology all around. As I said, the first apology delivered by Kay Montgomery in 2000 was actually a much better apology all round than the one that Jim Key delivered in 2014. The only problem with the first UUA apology for clergy sexual misconduct that UUA Executive Vice President Kay Montgomery delivered at the UUAGA in 2000 was that it turned out to be not worth the breath it was spoken with in terms of the failure of Kay Montgomery and the UUA to live up to the promises and pledges that were made in it. So the apology itself was okay. It was the failure to correct things that made it basically worthless in the end. But it took years to determine that. It took minutes to determine that Jim Key's apology was worthless. That's it for now.